what is 3 out of 50, I don't know. Yankel Lewin came up to me at the beginning and he says, Odero Plakat. Ludwig Zatz in a play called My Wife's Lover, Mein Weib's Lubovnik. And he said when he was a little boy, his father took him to see that play, and he says, Oi, is das gewesen a Schmate? And that's exactly what my program is. From melodrama to realism, how it happened and why. Professional Yiddish theater has been one of the most exciting and creative dynamic expressions of Jewish life for 150 years. Men hat gesagt, da Wertel, Jeden essen sehr Brot mit Theater. In other words, they loved their theater so much that they would spread their bread with it. Sometimes they took the sandwiches to the theater. Yiddish theater flourished in every corner of the globe. Wherever Yiddish-speaking Jews traveled, their theater went with them. Traveling Yiddish actors and companies went to wherever their audience was. And after the 1880s, Jews went all over the world when they left Eastern Europe. America, Mexico, Australia, all over, North America, Mexico, Argentina. In fact, Sholem Aleichem has a novel called Wandering Stars about two lovely young children, a young boy and a young girl, and how they met and how they traveled in Yiddish theater. It's been translated into English. You could therefore say that Yiddish theater is a world theater as the Yiddish language is a world language. It was a diverse theater. Productions covered the gamut from popular theater. Ludwig Zatz is an example of that. And what was popular theater? Mostly melodramas, comedies, musicals. That was called low art. But it was also but Yiddish theater also reached great artistic heights. There were literary plays, symbolism, expressionism, political theater, avant-garde theater. This was called high art. Yiddish theater was praised by critics all over the world, but it was also damned and criticized. So Yiddish theater really went from the sublime, from the wonderful, to the ridiculous, from the ridiculous to the sublime. The other poster here, one is from Gutmenschen, titled The Last One, a realistic play by Jacob Gordon, which we'll talk about, and Morris Schwartz's Yiddish Kunsttheater. So Yiddish theater went from ridiculous to the sublime and back and forth. It was a very unique theater. Not better, but unique. Very, very different, very unusual. Why? Because in 100 years, it developed from a primitive folk play like the Purim play to some of the most advanced theatrical productions in the modern theatrical world. What I'd like to do now is to show you 6 different criticisms, from the sublime to the ridiculous and back again. In 1910, Yitzhak Leibush Peretz, you're going to think I'm saying he thought the Yiddish theater was wonderful. Ayo, Herzogheim. He, together with a whole group of other intellectuals in Warsaw in 1910, called together a group of Yiddish writers, and they rented the largest hall in Warsaw. It was packed, not for a Yiddish theater performance, but for a symposium lasting 2 Saturdays afternoon, and the name of the symposium was Improving the Yiddish Theater. Wie kann wir machen einen besseren jiddischen Theater? because he didn't like what was going on in the Yiddish theater. Früher auf Yiddish und dann noch auf Englisch. Man hat die Frage gestellt, wer ist schuldig in dem, was das Yiddish Theater, auf welchem wir haben so lange gehofft, auf den Mashiach gewartet, für was spielt man Welwele esst kaputt? Sie seien schuldig, die jüdische Schreiber, was machen nicht kein Dramen. Sie kommt aufzuhängen, einem Entrepreneur, was verlangt vor euch Schmutz zu Kasse, meaning whatever comes in at the door. Sie öfter nur die jüdische Akteuren allein seien schuldig, was willen besser lernen, was willen besser machen, freilich dem Eulen. Glaubt mir an narischer Bekuach. Schuldig ist der Publikum, all of you. Das wüste, verscholtene Publikum, was hat euren nur für charmante Musik, euren nur für aufreißende Sachen, that means sexy things, und Geschmack für grobe, wilde Menschen, von Unmenschen. Eingesunken soll das werden. That's Paris. And in English, Yiddish theater is like a stew in a marketplace. And whatever you throw in cooks, what's yours, what's stolen, what's fresh, what's cold, what's old, even what's tainted. And who is responsible that Yiddish theater for which we hoped so long, waited as for a Messiah, plays Welwele est kaputt? Responsible is the public, that gloomy, recursive public that has ears only for the organ grinder, eyes only for the violent, and the taste of vulgar savages. May the earth swallow it up. Not nice. And when he got up at the symposium, hat gesagt, let no Jewish foot cross the threshold of the old Shun theaters. We will destroy the old theaters, and on its ruins we will build a new Yiddish art theater. On the other side, on one hand and on the other hand, 60 years later, in 1968, in a volume titled Yiddish Theater in Europa, zwischen beide Weltmilchomos, Itzik Manger's introduction is a complete reversal of Peretz's opinion. Manger, Oy Manger, that most innovative, unique Yiddish poet, speaks of the peculiar energy of the Yiddish stage and its audience. He had spent years in his youth in the company of Yiddish actors in Romania and Poland. And he says, der Yiddish Theater ist gewesen und geblieben a schön und treuere Kapitel in der modernen jiddischen Kulturgeschichte, was hat sich angehalten in Russland. And then he says, die befreite Spielenergie bei den jüdischen Volksmassen hat dynamisiert dem jüdischen Theater und die Akteure haben gespielt äußerst wenig. Und es ist gewesen gut, besser wie gut. Es ist gewesen Spiel, das Schem Spiel, Theater zu Theater. Äußerst wenig haben die Akteure gespielt. Und in sehr Freiheit haben sie auf der Bühne improvisiert und die Improvisation ist ein Gewinn, Molechein. The actor and the audience, the relationship of one to the other, it was this contact that was most characteristic in the history of the Yiddish theater. That liberated play energy of the Jewish masses truly dynamized the Yiddish theater. They played by heart, and it was good. It was better than good. It was play for the sake of play. Theater for the sake of theater. They ignored the tasks. They mocked the actors. Instinctively, they felt that they were free. They improvised freely on the stage, and their improvisations were filled with grace. So why, 60 years later, after Peretz damned them, why did Manger come along after the Second World War in '67 and talk with such love and Begeisterung about Yiddish theater? I think one reason is when you lose everything, you lose the actors, you lose the theater, you lose the whole world. And when you look back, you have a different perspective. Peretz was right in the middle, and he was so ashamed. Let's go to America. Ted Thomas. Anyone know who Ted Thomas is?
Yeah.
He is the father of Michael Tilson Thomas. Michael Tilson Thomas is the grandson of the conductor. Right, he is the conductor who is the grandson of Boris Tomaszewski. Well, the father, who was the second generation, the son of Boris Tomaszewski, he once said, "The Yiddish theater made the left bank of Paris look like a convent." There was every form of degeneration you could imagine. Murder, suicide, drugs, and sex. Can you believe that? These were the emergent Jews after living a Torah-cloistered existence, suddenly free and drunk with it. However, I'm going back and forth so you get the criticism of all the wonderful things and then the others. Here's a book that you should all own called The Spirit of the Ghetto. Studies of the Jewish Quarter of New York by a Goy, a non-Jew named Hutchins Hapgood. Hutchins Hapgood was a journalist for the New York Evening Journal, and he fell in love with the community on the Lower East Side. He went down there, listened, and wrote what is really like a sociological study of the community of the East European Lower East Side Jews. And it's amazing. He spent years there, learned some Yiddish. And the reason I say it's like a sociological study, there were chapters on the schools, on the Chedurim, on the journals, on the labor movement, on the coffee houses where all the intellectuals would gather. There was a whole big long chapter on the stage. And I quote from him, "The theater in this book, Ghetto, Studies of the Jews of the Lower East Side of New York." And he says, "The theaters of the chosen people, Erifton's chosen people. They present the serious as well as the trivial interests of the entire community. The audience are sweatshop women with babies, day laborers, shopkeepers, anarchists, socialists, ghetto rabbis and scholars, poets and journalists." Listen to this. "It is the only theater in which a truly varied populace could find a common meeting place. This Yiddish theater of the Lower East Side of New York at the turn of the century was a people's theater, a community theater. Therefore, it is true theater, the like of which is rarely ever to be achieved again in our country. The Bowery and Canal Street have more significance for American life than does Broadway and Fifth Avenue, in spite of what our dear Peretz says. Ist doch gut, ja. Kommt da zu gehen, David Kessler, and sagt, Schund is more profitable. In other words, schmatas like this are more profitable. I must do plays that attract the public if I'm going to pay the rent. But when I play trash, it's like drinking castor oil. Harold Clurman, Dean of Directors, great writer about the group theater in the 30s, marvelous, marvelous theater teacher, husband of Stella Adler. In the introduction to his book, which is a history of the group theater, that marvelous theater that created such wonderful actors, And he says, from the age of 6, when I was taken to see Jacob Adler in Uri La Costa at the Grand Street Theater, I had a passionate inclination toward the theater. Between the ages of 6, I had attended the theaters of the East Side where my father practiced medicine. In a way, this theatrical experience was fortunate, since the Yiddish theater was about the best in New York at that time, both in stuff and in acting. The stuff was frequently Shakespeare, Tolstoy, Gorky, or charming folk operettas by Goldfaden, and plays modeled after original works by Suderman. The actors, Herzog, the actors were among the best I have ever seen in many years of playgoing all over the world. Who did he see? He mentioned Jacob Adler. And I want to tell you about Jacob Adler. When most of the plays that were written, because at that time there were as yet no great Yiddish dramas, what did they do? If you wanted a good part, if you wanted to play a good play, and Adler was always looking for a good part, so what did he do? He played Shylock in The Merchant of Venice in a good Yiddish translation in the Lower East Side of New York. He was so wonderful as Shylock that they came from downtown, they came from uptown, all the Broadway producers came to see Jacob Adler's marvelous interpretation of Shylock. The East Side was going crazy because it was such a wonderful, popular thing. There was a New York producer, his name was Arthur Hopkins. And he went backstage after he saw the production and he said, Mr. Adler, you are amazing. You're so wonderful. Why do you do it in Yiddish? Play Shylock in English. Come to Broadway. You'll become world famous. We'll go on tour. And Adler says, but my English is not like your English. I speak with an accent. I speak with a Yiddish lilt, they say. I can only play Shylock, who is a Jew, like I am a Jew. I cannot do that. I will not come. And Hopkins, who was such a good theatrical businessman, a real showman, he says, I tell you what, Mr. Adler, you play Shylock in Yiddish. Everyone knows the play. All the other actors are going to speak in English, and we're going to do it on Broadway, and it's going to be a big success. And you know what? It was. It was. He played in Yiddish. People knew what he said. And all the other actors were in English. It went on tour. And why was it so successful? And I read to you from Adler's own autobiography. How did he play Shylock? Why did it become so famous? Because Adler says, Shylock's scorn, his scorn, he looked down on them, would be the only cut, the only wound that Antonio would suffer. He didn't take the pound of flesh, of course. So Antonio has insulted and spit on the Jew, and yet he comes with hypocritical politeness to borrow money of him. Instead of the legal interest on his loan, he binds himself to a preposterous forfeit, the pound of flesh, and he never expects to pay that. The two men are confronted in a court of justice, packed with Antonio, the friends, the judge, committed to Antonio's cause, and Shylock is alone with nobody on his side. The verdict, of course, goes against him. He's found guilty. Antonio and the court divide the spoils, and between them, and the only thing that Shakespeare says in his script, because he never described a character, he only had characters' words, and all it says in Shakespeare's script is, exit Shylock. And what does Shylock do? What does Adler do? He says, having bought so dearly the right to his contempt of his Christian enemies, would he not walk out of the courtroom, head erect, the very symbol of defiant hatred and scorn? And that is the way I see Shylock, and that is how I played him. And then he walks out of the court, head erect, looking at all of his enemies. Every other actor who ever played Shylock before that walked out as a defeated Jew with his head down, schlepping the feet, dragging himself off the stage. But not Adler. And that's why he was so unbelievable. You don't believe me? I read you a review. Adler, before he read the review, they stayed up all night waiting for reviews. This was in Philadelphia. What would the world say about me? How would they accept the Yiddish actor in the role made famous by Booth and Irving, an actor from New York's Lower East Side, on an American stage, our Yiddish language side by side with Shakespeare's immortal Yiddish, or Shakespeare's immortal English? And the Philadelphia Inquirer says, with the memory of Booth still undimmed, and other of our foremost tragedians still fresh in memory, it may perhaps be considered an exaggeration to say that the Shylock of Jacob P. Adler is the greatest ever seen on the American stage. As an actor, Adler must stand among the great. His Shylock alone could plant him there, for it is a complete, remarkable impersonation of a character. Adler is a genius in his interpretation. Wie viele Jiden auf der Lower East Side or in New York sind gegangen sind Shakespeare? So viel. The big critics of the papers, they knew it was wonderful. What did most Jews in New York or any place else want? What did they want to see? Sein Weib, Slubovnik, or anything else. Who were the American audience of the early Yiddish theater? Like Yankel said, his papa took him. Or other, how many of you ever went as children to the Yiddish theater? You gedenkt? Who were they, those immigrants? Those 2.5 million Jews who between the 1890s and 1924 fled the pogroms. The history, the sociology is well known, but the statistics boggle the mind. In 1880, 4% of the total population of New York was Jewish. By 1910, it was 23%, and by the early 1930s, 1/3 of New York was Jewish. They tended to come in family groups, more so than other immigrants, and they mostly came from urban and semi-urban areas, larger cities and smaller cities, nicht Dörfer, not little dwarfs. It seemed that almost at once theater became an important part of American Jewish life. They needed the theater. The East Side stimulated the need for it. And to buy a ticket was a necessity, not an extravagance. Hutchins Hapgood, which I told you about, talks of sweatshop girls earning $5 a week, spending half of it on theater tickets to see matinee idol Boris Tomaszewski in a melodrama. What's a melodrama? Yankel tells us it's a schmata. How do you define what is a melodrama? Well, first of all, good and evil are expressed in extremes. As oder sehr gut oder sehr schlecht. Nicht in das Mitten. Jeder Mensch hat doch ein bisschen gut und ein bisschen schlecht. In a melodrama ist man oder schlecht oder gut. The acting and the dialogue is very, very mannered, in other words, and stylized. Oi, ich hab ihn lieb. Du bist ein schlechter Mensch. Ich hab ein Bauchweitig. Oh, ich hab gemacht ein Toast. Ich hab ein Kopfweitig. Right? Melodrama is exaggerated. It's what we say in English, it's corny. There are stereotyped characters. Who are the stereotyped characters in a melodrama? A villain, ja, a schlechte.
Hero.
A heroine. Oh, ik heb hem lief. An old grandmother. Was he's standing as I on the same. My rheumatism is killing me. There has to be a lot of suspense. There have to be sensational episodes. Virtue, goodness, kindness always triumphs in the end. And there must be action, action, action. Melodrama didn't come by itself. Somebody just didn't decide to invent it. Everything that happens in theater happens because of a specific reason, a world event. Zog hello and then also goodbye and fart. Hier heb Asa der Gerrits by telephones. Maar ik heb alleen op een point in New York en ik ga verder met hier als ik op die papi die mekwa. Melodramas happen because of an industrial revolution, and you're going to say, what has that got to do with melodrama? Everything in the world. When people in America or in Europe, in Eastern Europe, started leaving the small towns, the Städtler, and moving to the big cities, that's when melodrama came about. Why? Because the big audiences, the newer audiences in the big cities, you think New York was always New York or Chicago? Oh, no. At the beginning of the early 1880s, it was a one-horse town. And then it grew. Why? Because work was there, the jobs were there. You had to go to the big city. And when you went to the big city, you also needed entertainment. You had never seen theater before. You had never read books about it. And all of a sudden you went to the theater and you found yourself on the stage. Because melodrama, unusual and different than Shakespeare or Moliere. Why? Because melodrama made the poor guy, the worker, the lumberjack, the hero. He was the hero. And all of a sudden, the common man in a melodrama is the hero of the play. Not the rich man, the landlord. In Shakespeare, all of his characters, kings, queens, princes, lords, ladies. And who are the poor? The poor, the bumpkins, the country bumpkins. But in a melodrama, all of a sudden, the common people in all the cities that were growing, in Lodz, in Warsaw, they went to the theater, and het gesehen am Melodrama, sie gewinnt gut, weil der Automat ist gewinnt der Held. Are melodramas over with? Absolutely not. We see them all the time. Every other movie is a big melodrama. Titanic. In that movie Titanic, pure melodrama. Who's the big hero? She doesn't even love the rich guy. She loves the poor guy. Besides, he can dance better than the rich one. So melodramas all of a sudden had their place in theater history. What were some of the names of the American theater plays? The Black Crook, The Drunkard. In große Drama das nicht gewinnt. 2 Nights in a Barroom and The Perils of Pauline. That play had the famous scene where the heroine is tied to the railroad tracks and she schneit and she gewaltet. Does the landlord come to save her? No. Who is it? The lumberjack, the worker, an honest worker. And who is the landlord? He's the mean SOB who says, You must pay the rent. And the little old lady says, but I can't pay the rent. You must pay the rent, but I can't pay the rent. The worker, the poor guy. And the Yiddish theater was no different. The Yiddish theater had wonderful, wonderful titles. Not only melodramas, but mit so tatige Kontratschen vergelegter. A number of years ago, we found by accident, and I think Herschel Hartman helped us find it, Yiddish play scripts in the Library of Congress includes Yiddish play scripts under the section entitled American Variety Stage, Vaudeville and Popular Entertainment, 1870 to 1920. Over 70 titles. I will read you only a few. Here's one. From Happiness to the Gallows. Von Glück zu Strick. An operetta in 4 Akten. Liebe in the Berg, Love in the Mountains. A Komödie in 4 Akten. Mein Weib is in the country, hurrah, hurrah! A musical comedy in 3 acts. Mein Weib's Husband. A comedy drama in 4 acts. Not only that, es ist ein Lebensbild mit Gesang und Tanz in 4 Akten. Verkäuft zu Schande. Ihr könnt es sich vorstellen. Die Gangsters. Nicht die Gaslonen, nur die Gangsters. 4 Akten Drama von East Side Leben. Der Grüner Millionär. A comedy in 4 acts. Gebeut auf ein Fakt, was hat passiert in 1894. Die Mama von der Welt, oder Kinder, kommt daheim! Fahr der Chassene. Aber mit einem Prolog und einem Epilog in 4 Akten. Mit Gesang und Tanz in 3 Akten mit einem Prolog und einem Epilog. I only picked out just a few. There are 77 here. And the pièce de résistance, Rochele de Meshugene, a Komödie in 4 Akten. And for you to really and truly appreciate what a melodrama is. Yes?
You didn't mention the Federal Theater, whom had such a wonderful Jewish section, and I was a part of it. And if the Yiddish theater wasn't that important, they certainly wouldn't have had it. And this was in the late 30s.
Yeah.
And
This person has just told us
and
that.
they did some wonderful work there, and they had a lot of people from the Artef also.
That the Yiddish Theater Project of the WPA.
And they had, who was this man from a special Russian theater group? And then his brother, I think, was.
Can we hear questions till the end of the lecture?
Okay, so thank you very much. There was a Yiddish Theater Project of the WPA, which was wonderful.
Yes.
Now, the Jewish heart. Are Jewish hearts any different than other hearts?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I met your husband there, your first husband. I think I told you about it.
Yes. I'm going to read you a scene. I'm going to act for you a scene in a melodrama. I love melodramas. Why? Because good acting darfen sein verzäumt. You have to hold back. But in dramas, melodramas, you can let it go, and it's great fun for actors to play that. I'm going to have fun. I hope you do too. The name of this melodrama is The Jewish Heart, Das Jiddisch Herz, von a Schreiber, was sein Name ist gewesen, Yosef Leitener. I had the translation in Nama Sandro's book, but I wanted the original Yiddish. Ich bin gegangen zum Yivo, and Bima is then, sie noch ausgelebt von Wilna, und ich habe ihr gesagt, sie ist gewesen eine Kleine, ich bin auch eine Kleine, aber sie ist noch ausgewesen als so ein Klein. Kleiner von mir. And I said, ich will haben das jiddische Skript für das Jiddisch Herz von Leitener. And as small as she was, smaller than me, she stood up as tall as she could and she said, Leitener will dir was etwas Leitener? In other words, she had nothing to do, she wanted nothing. I said, because I'm doing a program and I have it in English, but I need it in Yiddish. She says, Jeder wird davon bezahlen for them. And I paid 25 cents a copy, but I'm going to read it in English. And I want to tell you the story. There was a young girl. She was 17 and she was beautiful. But her family was very poor. And so they married her off to the richest man in town, even though she hated him. She was 17 and he was 77. Oya Broch is right. And after 1 year of marriage, there she is walking down the street, pushing a carriage, pushing a parade, with this beautiful little boy. His name is Yankel Abramovitz. And she's talking to him and she's looking at him. And all of a sudden, from far down the road, she sees a tall, tall man with epaulets and a hoicher hood. Jews don't come so tall. And she sees this beautiful man. His name is Count Popescu. And their eyes meet. And oi, at that moment, her passion overwhelms her. And what does she do? She turns to Yankele and she says, Sei gesund, Yankele, goodbye. And she runs and runs after Count Popescu. Ich wollte gesagt, wissen, wie sie ist gelaufen, aber ich kann nicht laufen, es tut mir weh, die Fies. As she runs away, the curtain falls, the end of one act. In the second act, sie kommen ein Akteur, und ist nicht gewinnt, ein guter Akteur, und hat gemacht eine Audition. Und der Regisseur hat gesagt, sorg sich nicht mit der Gegnerrolle. What was his part? He held up a sign from one side of the stage, and he would walk it to the other side of the stage, and the sign would say, Zweiter Akt. In the second act, they're in a wonderful, beautiful art gallery. On one side, beautiful pictures, golden frames, and there's an easel like this easel in state, paintings by Victor Popescu. On the other side, other paintings in wooden frames, little houses, little streets. A sign on an easel says, paintings by Abraham Abramsko. And all of a sudden, the painter Victor comes out and he says, you Jew, what are you doing? We don't need your dirty little paintings of little streets and houses. And of course, Victor, what the heck was his name? Der Yitzhak. Bist ein Antisemit. Ich habe ein Recht zu sein. I have a right to be here just like you do. And they argue again. Act 3. In Yankel's bedroom. und sie geht durch eine Freude, geht hin und zurück. Oi, es ist so krank. Oi, weh. If a melodrama has anything else, it has unbelievable situations. All of a sudden, Yankel has a fiancée. From wann is sie gekommen, when is he gekommen, it doesn't matter, she's there. And he's very sick. And he's in a four-poster bed. And a four-poster bed has a curtain. And in walks, 20 Jahre später, Madame Popescu, not the 17-year-old. Her hair is up on her head. Because when she came into the gallery, and she saw the name Abramsky, Yankel Abramsky, hat sie gewusst, dass es ihr Yankele, ist sie gegangen im Suchen in sein Heim. And she walks in, and there he is in bed. And what does she do? She pulls the curtain aside, and she says, "Ah, noble picture, heart-quickening appearance. My Jewish child, my Yiddish kin, believe me, never has mother loved her child as I love you, my Yankele. Oh, how bitterly I now regret it. Can you ever forgive me, my mother? Can you ever forgive your mother, my good child, my Jewish child?" And Yankele, who's been asleep, "Is that you, madame, in such a condition as this? Please rise, madame," because she's on her knee begging him. Ihr wollt das gewissen, aber es tut mir weh. And she says, "No, I will not rise, not until you say you will hear me out. But first, take a seat, madame." You see, all the language is so formal. It's so unbelievable. It's so not realistic. "Please take a seat, madame," he says. And she says to him, "Hear me out. When I married your father, I was a child, 15 Jahre alt. Habe nicht geheiratet vor Liebe. My poor parents pressed me to become a rich man's wife. 3 years later, chance brought me together with my present husband, and then I too loved, as only an 18-year-old loves for the first time in her life. I sacrificed everything for him, for the emotion of my first love bewitched me, enchanted me. I acted without thinking, without considering. But when I grow older, the first enchantment passed. With time, I recalled more and more strongly my own dear ones I'd left behind. You in his cradle. Most of all, I recalled my child whom I left behind. Ah, how often a burning longing came over me, and like a mad woman, I wanted to run out into the world, run and find my child. But by then, I was already a mother of 2 Christian children, and they too still lay in their cradles. And this mother heart of mine was torn in two. I did not know with whom to sacrifice, whom to go to. You can imagine how I suffered in silence. Years passed, and the picture of my Jewish child did not fade until chance brought me to you as a grown man. Now, Yankel, this sinful woman kneels before you as before her judge. Hand down your verdict on your unsinful mother. Demand the hardest sacrifice from me. I will do it gladly. Only let me be your mama. He is so overcome. He stands up. He lifts her up from her knees and he says, "Mama!" And she embraces him and she says, "What heavenly words are these, mama to me?" Oh, Yankele hast a Yiddish hearts. That's why the play is called The Jewish Heart. And as they are embracing, the door opens up and in walks Victor, her Christian son. And he grabs her arm and he says to Yankel, "What are you doing embracing my mother?" And Yankel is taken by other hand by the mother, and he says, "She's not your mother, she's my mother." And Victor yelled, "No, she's my mother." Yankel, "No, she's my mother, she's my mother, no, she's my mother, she's..." And all of a sudden, Victor takes out a gun, and Yankel grabs his arm, and they tussle back and forth, and sie schreit, "Oi, Gewalt, Gewalt!" And they're yelling, and they're screaming, and all of a sudden, the gun goes off, and one of the sons falls to the ground. Tight, as erschossen. And all of a sudden, from the back of the stage, the door opens and a policeman appears. Was is dort gestanden? Where did he come from? But he was at the back of the stage, and he walks in and he says, "Wer hat erschossen diesen Mann?" And the mother, because she has a Jewish heart, steps forward and she says, Ich bin schuldig. Ich hab erschossen diesen Mann. And the policeman takes a rope. He knew he had to have one. And he binds her hands and he pulls her off the stage. And in the prologue and the epilogue, she comes out with her hair down in a long white gown and she sings, "Mutter Liebe." And the audience absolutely goes crazy. They stand on their chairs and they shout, "Bravo, bravo, she's wonderful." It's 2 o'clock in the morning because there were 3 acts in this play with 22 scenes in each act. In the morning they have to get up to go to the shop at 9 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning, but they don't care. They're going to discuss this wonderful play. The question is, wer liegt dort? Who got shot? Which son was shot? Was it Victor, der Goy, or was it Yankel? This is a true tragedy. How many of you think it was Yankel? How many of you think it was Victor?
Victor. Why is it important?
It has to be Victor because you cannot kill a Jewish boy in a Jewish play. That's a melodrama of the old Yiddish theater. Ein Kritiker hat geschrien, es ist schon a Schande, es ist a Schmatte, but the people loved it, and they came, and they enjoyed it. So, is it worth it? By the way, you laughed, but they took it very seriously. What is Schund? I looked it up in Weinrach, and he says, a literary trash. That's the classic name of what Schund is. Literary trash. It's a term of contempt. You go to see a play and it's awful or it's not well rehearsed, and they say, "Oh, it's just Schund." It's a theatrical term indicating trash, usually a melodrama with spectacular, unbelievable events, like the policeman standing in front of the door from Wann is er gekommen. It's an inept mishmash of a production. It's ill-prepared. It's a vulgar display on the... It's Yiddish kitsch. Anyone ever hear that expression?
No,
Yiddish?
sure.
What's Yiddish kitsch? An apron that you can buy on Fairfax which says Balafostel.
Yeah.
Or diapers which say Tushy on them. God forbid. Schund thrives on spectacular coincidence. Sometimes it's overly sentimentalized, like the song My Yiddish Mama. That's all Schund. Schmaltzy songs. So, it had to change. Something different had to come along. Melodrama, Schund, corny plays. Because art, true art, must always find new ways of expressing the changes in our society and our lives. True art brings those changes and changes society, examines it, changes it. I know there are plays that changed my life. I'm sure you're true of that. Movies that you saw that made you realize new things. True art. There were 2 men who created those differences. In the year 1892 marks the beginning of the first golden age in the Yiddish theater. And it's often called the Gordon era, the Jacob Gordon. Gordon was a political radical, a socialist, a Russian intellectual, and he was heavily influenced by Russian and European literature. He came to America in 1891 and found fertile ground for his theories. Drama, he said, should educate the masses to higher culture, to self-improvement, to socialist principles. Besides, the Yiddish-speaking intellectuals shunned the Yiddish theater. Soon it was they who began to play a great role in developing the Yiddish art theaters throughout the world. These young intellectuals, Yiddish-speaking writers, artists, took up the cry for a besseren theater. A besseren theater means not just a better theater, but a literary theater, well-rehearsed, a good theater. And in the coffee houses and restaurants and theater circles all through the East Side, they talked about it. But the changes in the Yiddish theater came about not only because of one man, Jacob Gordon. An actor helped as well. Who was that actor? That actor who had played with great intelligence, with great art, with great genius, was Jacob Adler. He was the dean of Yiddish actors at that time, and he longed for good parts. He didn't want to play Mein Weib's Lubovnik. He wanted to test his talents. And so Jacob Adler in 1892, he put a notice in the Yiddish paper in the Forbes. My new theater under the sole direction of Jacob Adler. How do you like he speaks about himself in third person? I have reorganized with the aim of driving from the Yiddish stage all that is crude, unclean, immoral, with the purpose of lifting the Yiddish theater to a higher level. And the intellectuals had found their hero. Jacob Adler, Jacob Adler, Jacob Adler. Now there's a name that brings an audience to its feet. A giant. He was born in Odessa. He fell in love with Yiddish theater at an early age, and he became known as the king of the first golden age of the Yiddish theater. Adler in Yiddish means eagle, and he was referred to as the great eagle in Hebrew, Nesher Hagadol. Adler was the perfect blend for Gordon characters. He had a monumental presence, an explosive temperament, a quiet simplicity that seemed so natural. He could switch from a whisper to a roar, rocking his audience up and down on an emotional roller coaster. And for 2 decades, Adler and Jacob Gordon dominated the theater. It was called the first golden age of the Yiddish theater. Gordon translated or borrowed, and he did a lot of borrowing from Hugo, Ibsen, Gogol, Shakespeare. The first time that Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen was ever played in the United States was in Yiddish on the Lower East Side. Jacob Adler and Gordon did something else. They brought discipline to a stage. They insisted on sticking to the script. Adler's first play that Gordon wrote was called Siberia. A young Jew, this is the plot, the young Jew is sentenced to Siberia. He escapes. He assumes another identity and he becomes wealthy. He's betrayed to the police by a business rival. There are no song and dance routines, no comic scenes. It looked as if the play would fail. The restless audience was unprepared for Gordon's kind of realism. There were blues and there were laughter. All of a sudden, Adler stepped out in front of the curtain, opened the curtain, and in costume he stepped out, and he looked at them and he said, "Ihr schämt sich von euch. I'm ashamed of you. You do not appreciate the great masterpiece by this famous Russian Jacob Gordon. If you understood how great this play was, you wouldn't laugh." And then he burst into tears. He was a very good actor. The audience was deeply impressed. They began to applaud, and in the final act, when the hero, played by Adler, is dragged away by the Tsarist police, the actors and the audience were all sobbing together. The next day, Abraham Kahn and the Arbeiter Zeitung called it a complete revolution on the Yiddish stage. And then, in another play as Gordon's Jacob, Jewish King Lear, Adler made himself close to divine on the Lower East Side. Why was it such an important play, Der Jiddischer König Lear? Because Gordon took the character of King Lear, where there's a dissonance, a fight between two generations. The Lear tragedy, adapted from the Shakespeare theme to Jewish needs. The conflict of generations was then raging with full force in immigrant homes. Old-fashioned fathers could no longer control Americanized children, and their heartache was mirrored on the stage. Sarah Adler later related from the first rehearsal, something extraordinary was happening. Every actor caught the spirit. If any of us clung to the old cheap effects, cheap laughter, the old undisciplined ways of parading himself before the public, we would stop. We would look at Adler, who was creating something unusual. That play, Der Jiddischer König Lear, remained in Adler's repertoire for over 30 years, and those who saw it will never forget the anger like crashes of thunder, scenes mounting in epic stroke to the moment when the old man, crying aloud his grief, goes out to beg on the streets because his children has thrown him out, and he calls out, "Shame deine Dove, shame deine Dove, der Jiddische König Lear." Arms, arms for the Jewish King Lear. The audience was transfixed. They were so with this man that one man, way in the back, ran down the aisle, banged on the stage and said, "You got rotten children, Mr. Adler. Come to my house, they will feed you, you'll be okay." The essence of Yiddish theater is or any theater. What is it? The suspension of disbelief. And they sure did suspend it. 10 years after the first performance, when New York critics began to take an interest in the downtown theater, the following review appeared in the New York Times. That Lear of Adler, a modernized Russian Hebrew, into which the old patriarch and his 3 daughters are transported in all their emotional picturesqueness, and with surpassing dramatic effect, is a poignant drama of domestic life. No finer acting in New York than Adler's gradual transition from the high estate of the Hebrew father, distributing his bounty to the opening scenes, to the quavering blind beggar of later developments. But the greatest play of all, the greatest socialist play of Gordon, was God, Man, and Devil. And in a prologue reminiscent of Goethe's Faust, from which it came, God and Satan enter a wager over the soul of Herschel Dubrovner. Herschel Dubrovner becomes the owner of a sweatshop. And what does this sweatshop produce? Taliesin. Taliesin. That's another play that Gordon writes. He wanted to produce religious articles. And so he creates a factory which becomes a sweatshop where taliesin are produced. Herschel, who was very poor and pious, is goaded by this symbolic character named Mazik, which is the devil. And Mazik says, Hassan out the vibes, he didn't get kinder. You have an old wife, she never had gave children to you. Marry your niece, Fredenju. And so he divorces the wife and he marries Fredenju.